In the dim candlelit chambers of Renaissance Florence, where political machinations flowed like wine and betrayal lurked in every shadow, Niccolò Machiavelli penned words that would echo through centuries of human ambition. Yet beneath the surface of his notorious prescriptions for princely power lay a deeper paradox, one that speaks not merely to the mechanics of political control, but to the very essence of human strength and vulnerability. This paradox reveals itself in the peculiar relationship between disengagement and dominance, between the deliberate destruction of one's weaker impulses and the consequent invulnerability to external forces. The essence of Machiavellian wisdom extends far beyond the crude interpretation of ruthless manipulation that popular culture has attributed to his name. At its core lies a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics that begins with a fundamental recognition: true strength emerges not from the accumulation of external advantages, but from the systematic elimination of internal weaknesses. The prince who would rule effectively must first learn to rule himself, and this self-mastery requires a kind of strategic disengagement from the very human qualities that, while potentially noble, render one predictable and exploitable. This document explores the intricate relationship between Machiavelli's strategic philosophy and the broader human condition, examining how the principle of disengaging from weakness while maintaining dominance over circumstances creates an almost impervious form of personal sovereignty. The analysis unfolds across three interconnected dimensions: the philosophical foundations of strategic disengagement, the practical mechanics of self-transformation, and the ultimate paradox of achieving invulnerability through the conscious destruction of one's vulnerable self. Part 1: The Architecture of Strategic Disengagement. The morning mist hung heavy over the Arno River as Lorenzo de' Medici walked the corridors of power, his footsteps echoing against stone walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless ambitions. In his private study, surrounded by the works of ancient philosophers and the correspondence of contemporary princes, he pondered a question that had plagued rulers since time immemorial: how does one maintain power in a world where strength is constantly tested, where allies become enemies with the changing of seasons, and where the very qualities that elevate a man to greatness can become the instruments of his downfall? The answer, as Machiavelli would later articulate with surgical precision, lay not in the accumulation of more power, but in the strategic abandonment of those aspects of human nature that made one vulnerable to manipulation, prediction, and, ultimately, destruction. This concept of strategic disengagement represents a fundamental departure from traditional notions of strength, which typically emphasize the enhancement and multiplication of positive qualities. Instead, Machiavellian strength emerges from a process of selective elimination, the conscious decision to destroy within oneself those characteristics that, however admirable in other contexts, constitute liabilities in the arena of power. The weak self, in this framework, is not defined by moral failings or character defects, but by predictability and emotional availability to external manipulation. It encompasses the natural human tendencies toward trust, sentiment, loyalty based on affection rather than utility, and the desire for approval or love from others. These qualities, while potentially beautiful and certainly necessary for the maintenance of human community and relationship, create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand their operations. Consider the merchant prince who, despite his vast wealth and political connections, finds himself undone by his genuine affection for a trusted advisor who has been secretly working to undermine his position. The affection itself is not a flaw, it speaks to the merchant's capacity for human connection and loyalty. However, in the context of political competition, this emotional investment creates a blind spot, a predictable pattern of behavior that a clever adversary can exploit. The merchant's strength lies in his business acumen and his wealth; his weakness lies in his emotional transparency and the predictable ways in which his genuine feelings influence his strategic decisions. Machiavelli's insight penetrates to the heart of this dilemma by proposing that true invulnerability requires the deliberate cultivation of what might be called strategic opacity, the ability to act from calculations that are not compromised by emotional investments or moral commitments that others can read and exploit. This does not necessarily mean becoming amoral or emotionally dead, but rather developing the capacity to separate one's strategic actions from one's emotional life in such a way that adversaries cannot predict behavior based on assumed emotional patterns. The process of strategic disengagement begins with rigorous self-examination and honest assessment of one's own emotional patterns, moral commitments, and psychological tendencies that might be used against oneself. This requires a kind of brutal honesty that most people find deeply uncomfortable, as it involves acknowledging not only one's weaknesses but the ways in which one's virtues might function as liabilities in competitive contexts. Francesco Sforza exemplified this principle in his rise to power in Milan. Born as a mercenary captain's son, he possessed natural charisma and genuine military talent. However, his early career was marked by setbacks that occurred precisely when his loyalty to employers exceeded what strategic calculation would have recommended. His transformation into one of Renaissance Italy's most successful rulers began when he learned to separate his personal inclinations toward honor and loyalty from his strategic decisions about when to maintain or break alliances. This did not make him a dishonorable man, but it made him an unpredictable one, and unpredictability, in the realm of political power, is a form of strength. The architecture of strategic disengagement involves several interconnected elements. First is the development of emotional compartmentalization, the ability to prevent emotional reactions from immediately translating into strategic decisions. This requires creating space between stimulus and response, allowing calculation to intervene between feeling and action. Second is the cultivation of multiple identity positions, the capacity to operate from different value systems depending on context, without losing one's core sense of self. Third is the practice of strategic ambiguity, deliberately maintaining uncertainty about one's true motivations, loyalties, and intentions, thereby preventing others from developing reliable models for predicting one's behavior. These elements work together to create what might be called a liquid form of power, one that cannot be easily grasped or contained because it does not present fixed points of leverage for others to exploit. The traditional strong man, with his clear loyalties, predictable moral commitments, and transparent emotional investments, presents numerous handles by which clever adversaries can manipulate him. The strategically disengaged individual, by contrast, offers no such convenient points of leverage. This form of disengagement should not be confused with withdrawal or passivity. On the contrary, it enables a more effective form of engagement with the world precisely because it is not compromised by the predictable patterns that emotional investment creates. The disengaged individual can form alliances more effectively because these alliances are based on mutual utility rather than emotional dependency. They can make strategic sacrifices more readily because they are not paralyzed by sentimental attachments to particular outcomes. They can adapt to changing circumstances more quickly because they are not invested in maintaining consistency with previous positions that may no longer serve their interests. The philosophical foundations of this approach can be traced to ancient Stoic thought, particularly the writings of Epictetus, who distinguished between what is up to us and what is not up to us. However, Machiavelli's innovation was to apply this insight specifically to the realm of power relations, recognizing that in competitive contexts, emotional availability and moral predictability constitute forms of strategic disadvantage. The Stoics sought detachment for the sake of inner peace and moral clarity. Machiavelli advocated it for the sake of external effectiveness and strategic advantage. The psychological mechanism underlying strategic disengagement involves what modern psychology might recognize as a sophisticated form of emotional regulation. Rather than suppressing emotions entirely, the strategically disengaged individual develops the capacity to experience emotions without being controlled by them, to maintain awareness of their own emotional states without allowing these states to dictate their strategic choices. This creates a form of inner freedom that translates into external power, the freedom to act based on calculation rather than compulsion, choice rather than conditioning. Yet this freedom comes at a cost, and Machiavelli was not naive about the psychological toll of strategic disengagement. The individual who successfully destroys their weak self may indeed become invulnerable to certain forms of external manipulation, but they also sacrifice some of the immediate pleasures and comforts that emotional investment provides. The merchant who learns not to trust may avoid betrayal, but he also forgoes the genuine pleasure of trust-based relationships. The prince who maintains strategic ambiguity may prevent his enemies from predicting his moves, but he also experiences a form of existential isolation that comes from never being fully known or understood by others. This brings us to the central paradox of Machiavellian power. The very process that makes one invulnerable to external destruction also creates a form of internal isolation that can be experienced as a kind of living death. The man who destroys his weak self achieves a form of immortality in the realm of power relations, but this immortality is purchased at the price of a certain kind of humanity. This paradox lies at the heart of Machiavelli's vision and creates the tension that animates all subsequent analysis of power and its psychological costs. Understanding this paradox is crucial for appreciating the sophisticated nature of Machiavellian thought. It is not a simple prescription for ruthlessness, but a complex analysis of the relationship between vulnerability and strength, between human connection and strategic advantage. The individual who masters the art of strategic disengagement does not become a monster, but rather a different kind of human being, one who has consciously chosen strategic effectiveness over emotional availability, calculated action over spontaneous response, long-term advantage over immediate satisfaction. Part 2. The mechanics of self-transformation. The transformation from vulnerable humanity to strategic invulnerability does not occur overnight, nor does it follow a simple linear progression. Like the alchemical processes that fascinated Renaissance intellectuals, the destruction of one's weak self and the emergence of strategic dominance requires careful attention to timing, method, and the subtle interactions between internal states and external circumstances. The mechanics of this transformation involve a systematic restructuring of one's relationship to desire, fear, attachment, and identity itself. Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua, provided a masterful example of this transformative process as she navigated the treacherous political landscape of early 16th century Italy. Born into privilege but thrust into a world where her small duchy was constantly threatened by larger powers, she faced the choice between traditional feminine roles that would have made her dependent on the protection of male relatives, or the development of her own strategic capabilities that would allow her to protect her interests through a more complex form of political engagement. Her transformation began with what might be called the mapping of vulnerabilities, a systematic identification of all the ways in which her natural inclinations, social conditioning, and emotional investments created opportunities for others to manipulate or control her. She recognized that her genuine love for her children, while personally meaningful, created hostages to fortune that enemies could exploit. Her desire for intellectual recognition and cultural achievement, while admirable, could be used to flatter her into strategic mistakes. Her social training toward courtesy and accommodation, while smoothing daily interactions, prevented her from taking the decisive actions that political survival sometimes required. The process of transformation involved learning to experience these natural inclinations without being governed by them. This required developing what might be called dual consciousness, the ability to simultaneously inhabit her natural emotional responses while maintaining a separate analytical perspective that evaluated these responses for their strategic implications. When envoys from France arrived seeking alliance against the Pope, she could experience her natural inclination toward loyalty to the Church while simultaneously calculating the political and economic advantages of various possible responses. This dual consciousness allowed her to respond from choice rather than conditioning, strategy rather than sentiment. The development of dual consciousness requires specific practices and disciplines. The first involves what the ancient Greeks called prosoche, constant attention to one's own mental states and the ways in which external circumstances trigger predictable internal reactions. Isabella maintained detailed private journals in which she recorded not only external events but her own emotional responses to these events, gradually developing sophisticated awareness of her own psychological patterns and the ways in which these patterns could be anticipated and manipulated by others. The second discipline involves systematic exposure to discomfort, deliberately placing oneself in situations that activate one's emotional vulnerabilities while practicing the maintenance of strategic perspective. Isabella regularly entertained guests whose presence she found personally distasteful, not out of masochism but as a form of training in the separation of personal reaction from strategic response. These exercises in emotional discipline gradually expanded her capacity to act effectively even when her natural inclinations pulled in different directions. The third discipline involves the cultivation of what might be called strategic imagination, the ability to model multiple possible futures and to evaluate present choices based on their likely consequences across a range of scenarios rather than their immediate emotional appeal. This requires developing comfort with uncertainty and ambiguity, since strategic effectiveness often demands acting on incomplete information while maintaining awareness of multiple contingent possibilities. The psychological mechanism underlying these disciplines involves a fundamental restructuring of the ego's relationship to experience. Rather than identifying directly with emotional states, desires, and immediate reactions, the transformed individual learns to identify with the observing consciousness that witnesses these states while maintaining the capacity to choose responses based on broader considerations. This creates a form of inner stability that is not dependent on external circumstances, since the individual's core sense of self is located in their capacity for strategic choice rather than in particular outcomes or conditions. This process of ego restructuring often involves what psychologists might recognize as a controlled form of dissociation, a deliberate separation of identity from immediate experience that allows for more flexible and strategic responses to challenging circumstances. However, unlike pathological dissociation, which involves unconscious fragmentation as a response to trauma, strategic dissociation is a conscious practice that enhances rather than diminishes overall functioning. The transformation also requires developing new relationships to fundamental human drives such as the desire for love, recognition, security, and meaning. The weak self seeks to satisfy these drives directly through external validation, possession, and control. The transformed self learns to satisfy these drives indirectly through the exercise of strategic capability itself. Isabella found deep satisfaction not in being loved or admired by particular individuals, but in her growing mastery of complex political situations. Her sense of security came not from the protection of others, but from her own demonstrated ability to navigate threats and opportunities effectively. This shift from direct to indirect satisfaction of basic drives creates a form of psychological independence that translates into strategic advantage. The individual who needs love, admiration, or security from others can be controlled through the manipulation of these needs. The individual who derives satisfaction from their own strategic effectiveness is much more difficult to manipulate, since their core psychological needs are met through their own activities rather than through others' responses. The development of strategic effectiveness also requires mastering what might be called tactical empathy, the ability to understand others' perspectives, motivations, and emotional states without becoming emotionally invested in these states. This form of empathy serves strategic rather than emotional purposes, providing information about others' likely behaviors and vulnerabilities without creating emotional bonds that might compromise strategic judgment. Isabella demonstrated tactical empathy in her dealings with Cesare Borgia, accurately reading his psychological makeup and strategic intentions while maintaining sufficient emotional distance to respond effectively to his threats and overtures. She understood his pride, his ambitions, and his fears without sharing them, allowing her to predict his likely actions and position herself advantageously in relation to his schemes. This form of understanding served her strategic interests without creating the kind of emotional connection that might have compromised her judgment or created vulnerabilities he could exploit. The transformation process also involves developing comfort with moral ambiguity and the abandonment of what might be called moral luxury, the ability to make choices based purely on ethical considerations without regard for consequences. The weak self often clings to moral certainty as a form of psychological comfort, even when such certainty leads to strategic disasters. The transformed self recognizes that in complex situations, all choices involve moral compromise, and that effective action often requires choosing the lesser of available evils rather than holding out for pure moral solutions that may not exist. This does not mean abandoning morality altogether, but rather developing a more sophisticated moral framework that takes consequences into account and recognizes that different contexts may require different ethical approaches. Isabella supported the Church when doing so served her broader purposes, opposed it when resistance was necessary for her duchy's survival, and maintained sufficient strategic flexibility to shift positions as circumstances changed. This flexibility scandalized some contemporaries who preferred moral consistency, but it allowed her to protect her people and preserve her dynasty through several decades of extraordinary political turbulence. The psychological costs of this transformation are significant and should not be minimized. The process of destroying one's weak self inevitably involves grief, the loss of simpler forms of happiness, more direct forms of satisfaction, and the particular comfort that comes from moral certainty and emotional spontaneity. Isabella's later letters reveal a sophisticated awareness of what she had sacrificed in the service of strategic effectiveness, even as she demonstrated no regret about the necessity of these sacrifices. The transformed individual often experiences a form of existential loneliness that comes from operating at a level of psychological sophistication that few others share. When one's primary satisfactions come from strategic mastery rather than emotional connection, when one's security derives from internal capability rather than external protection, and when one's moral framework is based on consequence rather than rule, communication and intimacy with others becomes more complex and sometimes more limited. Yet this loneliness is accompanied by a form of freedom and power that many find more than adequate compensation for what has been lost. The individual who has successfully destroyed their weak self possesses capabilities and options that remain unavailable to those who remain trapped in emotional reactivity and moral rigidity. They can form alliances based on mutual advantage rather than sentiment, make decisions based on long-term calculation rather than immediate impulse, and maintain strategic position even when circumstances become challenging or threatening. The mechanics of self-transformation ultimately involve learning to derive satisfaction from different sources than those that motivated the weak self. Instead of seeking external validation, the transformed individual finds meaning in the exercise of strategic capability. Instead of avoiding discomfort, they learn to find satisfaction in their growing capacity to function effectively despite discomfort. Instead of seeking security through dependency, they develop security through demonstrated competence in managing uncertainty and threat. This transformation is not available to everyone, nor is it appropriate for all contexts. It requires specific psychological capabilities, particular kinds of intelligence, and circumstances that make such transformation necessary or advantageous. Not everyone has the psychological constitution to sustain the disciplines required, and many people are better served by other approaches to managing life's challenges and opportunities. Part 3: The Paradox of Invulnerability. The ultimate achievement of Machiavellian self-transformation presents a curious contradiction that illuminates fundamental tensions in human existence itself. The individual who has successfully destroyed his weak self and achieved strategic invulnerability finds himself in a position that is simultaneously supremely powerful and profoundly isolated, masterfully effective and existentially ambiguous. This paradox reveals deeper truths about the nature of power, the costs of invulnerability, and the complex relationship between strength and humanity that continues to challenge those who would master the art of strategic living. Cesare Borgia, perhaps the most notorious exemplar of Machiavellian principles in action, embodied this paradox in its starkest form. Through systematic application of strategic ruthlessness, political calculation, and the deliberate suppression of conventional moral constraints, he achieved a level of power and fear-inspiring effectiveness that made him virtually untouchable by ordinary means. Enemies who might have destroyed a more conventional leader found themselves unable to predict his actions, manipulate his emotions, or exploit his loyalties because he had systematically eliminated the psychological vulnerabilities that such tactics typically target. Yet Borgia's very success in achieving invulnerability created new forms of vulnerability that were perhaps more profound than those he had eliminated. His strategic opacity, while protecting him from conventional forms of manipulation, also prevented him from forming the kinds of genuine alliances that might have provided long-term security. His emotional detachment, while preserving him from sentimental errors in judgment, also isolated him from the forms of human connection that might have provided intelligence, support, or simple human comfort. His moral flexibility, while allowing him to respond effectively to changing circumstances, also created uncertainty among potential supporters about his ultimate intentions and reliability. The paradox deepens when we consider that Borgia's invulnerability was achieved through methods that required him to become, in many ways, inhuman. The destruction of his weak self involved not merely the elimination of strategic liabilities, but the systematic suppression of qualities that many would consider essential to human flourishing: empathy, trust, spontaneity, moral consistency, and the capacity for genuine intimacy. In becoming invulnerable to external destruction, he had perhaps destroyed something essential within himself, achieving a form of living death that was the price of his immunity to more conventional forms of dying. This paradox extends beyond individual psychology to encompass broader questions about the nature of power and its relationship to human values. The Machiavellian path to invulnerability represents one possible response to the fundamental human condition of vulnerability: the recognition that we are all subject to forces beyond our control, dependent on others for our survival and flourishing, and ultimately mortal beings whose projects and ambitions are subject to the uncertainties of time and circumstance. The traditional responses to this vulnerability involve various forms of denial, protection, or transcendence. Religion offers the promise of ultimate security through divine protection or eternal salvation. Love and community provide the comfort of shared vulnerability and mutual support. Art and creativity offer forms of symbolic immortality through lasting achievement. Philosophy provides frameworks for understanding and accepting the human condition. The Machiavellian response is more radical and, perhaps more honest. It acknowledges the reality of vulnerability while refusing to accept it as unchangeable. Instead of seeking external protection, transcendent meaning, or consoling illusions, it proposes the systematic elimination of vulnerability through the transformation of the self into something that cannot be easily threatened or destroyed. This approach has the virtue of practical effectiveness. It often works, at least in the short to medium term, but it also involves costs that may be greater than the vulnerabilities it eliminates. The nature of these costs becomes clearer when we examine the lived experience of those who have achieved Machiavellian invulnerability. Contemporary accounts of figures like Borgia, Isabella d'Este in her later years, or the various Renaissance princes who successfully applied strategic principles to their rule reveal a consistent pattern: external effectiveness accompanied by internal emptiness, strategic mastery combined with existential isolation, immunity to conventional threats coupled with susceptibility to more subtle forms of psychological and spiritual deterioration. The invulnerable individual often discovers that the achievement of perfect strategic position is itself a kind of trap. Having eliminated emotional spontaneity in favor of calculated response, they find themselves unable to experience the simple pleasures that make life meaningful for most people. Having abandoned trust in favor of tactical alliances, they discover that genuine human connection becomes increasingly difficult or impossible. Having replaced moral consistency with strategic flexibility, they lose access to the sense of meaning and purpose that moral commitment can provide. Perhaps most paradoxically, the very success of the transformation can become a new form of vulnerability. The individual who has achieved Machiavellian mastery often discovers that their strategic capabilities become their primary source of identity and satisfaction, creating a new form of dependency that is potentially as limiting as the emotional dependencies they eliminated. If their identity is based on strategic effectiveness, then situations that threaten this effectiveness threaten their core sense of self. If their satisfaction comes primarily from the exercise of power, then circumstances that limit their power become sources of existential crisis. This creates what might be called the Midas paradox of Machiavellian success, the achievement of exactly what one sought, only to discover that the achievement itself has transformed both the achiever and the nature of satisfaction in ways that make the victory hollow. King Midas received the power to turn everything he touched to gold, only to discover that this included food, drink, and, ultimately, his own daughter. The Machiavellian prince achieves the power to transform every relationship into a strategic calculation, only to discover that this transformation eliminates the possibility of the kinds of relationships that make power worth having. The paradox becomes even more complex when we consider the temporal dimension of Machiavellian invulnerability. The strategies that provide short-term protection from external threats may create long-term vulnerabilities that are even more dangerous. The prince who eliminates potential rivals through strategic manipulation may find himself surrounded by individuals who are either too weak to provide useful counsel or too intelligent to remain trustworthy. The leader who maintains power through fear and calculation may discover that these methods, while effective in crisis situations, are inadequate for the kinds of long-term institution building that create lasting security. Moreover, the very effectiveness of Machiavellian methods often creates opposition that becomes increasingly sophisticated and dangerous over time. The prince who successfully uses strategic deception against his enemies teaches them to become better at detecting and countering such deception. The leader who achieves dominance through the exploitation of others' vulnerabilities inspires those others to eliminate their vulnerabilities and develop counter-strategies. Success in the Machiavellian game often raises the level of the game itself, requiring ever more sophisticated and morally costly strategies to maintain position. The psychological toll of sustaining Machiavellian invulnerability over time is perhaps even more significant than the strategic challenges it creates. The individual who has successfully destroyed their weak self must live with the consequences of this destruction, not merely as external costs but as internal realities. The capacity for spontaneous joy, genuine surprise, unguarded love, and moral certainty, once destroyed, cannot be easily recovered. The person who has learned to treat every situation strategically, every relationship as potentially exploitative, and every emotional response as a possible weakness may find themselves unable to experience the kinds of meaning and satisfaction that made the pursuit of power seem worthwhile in the first place. Yet it would be a mistake to conclude that the Machiavellian path is simply a form of elaborate self-destruction disguised as strategic wisdom. For some individuals, in some circumstances, the transformation may indeed represent the best available response to genuinely threatening situations. The person facing enemies who will exploit any weakness, operating in contexts where strategic naivety leads to destruction, may find that the costs of Machiavellian transformation are preferable to the costs of remaining vulnerable to manipulation and attack. The key insight is that these costs are real and should be acknowledged rather than denied. The man who destroys his weak self achieves a form of invulnerability, but this invulnerability comes at the price of certain forms of humanity. Whether this price is worth paying depends on circumstances, personality, values, and the available alternatives. For some, the trade may be necessary and even liberating. For others, it may represent a cure that is worse than the disease. The ultimate paradox of Machiavellian invulnerability lies in its relationship to the human search for meaning and fulfillment. Power is typically pursued not for its own sake, but as a means to other ends: security, freedom, the ability to protect what one values, or the capacity to achieve one's goals and ambitions. The Machiavellian transformation often achieves these instrumental objectives while undermining the ultimate purposes they were meant to serve. The prince who gains the power to protect what he values may discover that the process of gaining this power has changed him in ways that make him incapable of valuing anything in the way he once did. This suggests that the Machiavellian path, while sometimes necessary, should be approached with full awareness of its costs and limitations. It represents one possible response to the human condition, but not necessarily the optimal response for all individuals or all situations. The wisdom lies not in blindly embracing or rejecting Machiavellian principles, but in understanding when and how they might be appropriately applied, and what the full consequences of their application are likely to be. The man who destroys his weak self can indeed become invulnerable to certain forms of external destruction, but he also becomes vulnerable to forms of internal dissolution that may be more profound and permanent than the threats he sought to avoid. The achievement of perfect strategic position may be purchased at the cost of the very things that made such position seem desirable. This is the ultimate paradox of Machiavellian power: its very success can become its most profound failure, its greatest strength its most subtle weakness. In recognizing this paradox, we neither condemn nor celebrate the Machiavellian path, but rather seek to understand it in all its complexity and ambiguity. Like all profound insights into the human condition, Machiavellian wisdom reveals truths that are simultaneously liberating and troubling, empowering and sobering. The prince who would apply these insights must do so with full awareness that in gaining the world of strategic effectiveness, he may indeed lose something essential to his own soul, and must decide whether the exchange is worth making. The candles in Lorenzo's study burned low as he contemplated these truths, their flickering light casting shadows that danced across the pages of Machiavelli's manuscript. Outside, Florence slept under the protection of walls and guards, its citizens secure in their beds, trusting in the power of their rulers to preserve them from the chaos that perpetually threatened to engulf their ordered world. Yet Lorenzo knew, as all true students of power must know, that this security was itself an illusion, that beneath the surface calm lay currents of ambition, betrayal, and strategic calculation that could sweep away entire dynasties with the suddenness of a spring flood. The question that had brought him to his midnight studies remained unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. In a world where strength invites challenge and weakness invites destruction, where love becomes vulnerability and trust becomes folly, what manner of man can hope to endure? Machiavelli's answer, that such a man must cease to be entirely human in the conventional sense, offered both solution and damnation, both freedom and a peculiar form of slavery. As the night deepened and the city slumbered, Lorenzo closed the manuscript and rose from his chair, understanding finally that the greatest victory of Machiavellian wisdom lay not in its prescriptions for action, but in its unflinching recognition of the price that all action exacts. The man who would rule others must first learn to rule himself, and, in learning this rule so completely that he becomes invulnerable to external control, he may discover that he has achieved the most perfect form of internal imprisonment. Such is the paradox of power, that in seeking to become masters of our world, we risk becoming strangers to ourselves. The weak self dies hard, and perhaps it should. In its dying, something essential to human experience dies with it, something that no amount of strategic mastery can restore, no degree of external power can replace. Whether this sacrifice serves the greater good, whether the security it purchases justifies its cost, whether the man who emerges from this transformation remains sufficiently human to make the achievement worthwhile, these questions each prince must answer for himself, in the solitude of his own darkened chambers, with only the flickering shadows for company and the weight of empire for comfort.